Okay, well, welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday. I'm Jay Warmke with solarpvtraining.com. And if you're new to this format, what we do is we recap what's been happening in the world of solar over the last week or so. And then I try and recap whatever webinars are coming up. And then we go into a deep dive on a topic that's energy related, solar related in specific. But this week is an example of one that's not directly related with solar. Indirectly, it is, which is our small nuclear reactors going to save us from data centers? And I'll explain in a minute why I decided to focus on that. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and recap the news that's from the solar industry for the week of October 26th, 2025, just to sort of date stamp that if you're looking at a video. All right, so despite significant policy headwinds imposed by the Trump administration, new electrical generating capacity from renewable energy continues to significantly outpace that produced from fossil fuel sources. During the past 12 months, power generation from wind, solar, and batteries increased by over 55,000 megawatts. Generation from fossil fuels actually declined by 1,400 megawatts during the same period of time. Solar and batteries accounted for 82% of all new power added to the grid. Generation from natural gas grew a modest 3,300 megawatts since October, but this growth was offset by a decline in generation from coal and petroleum-based fuels. Electricity from nuclear power essentially held constant during the past year, with no new nuclear power plants currently under construction. Energy regulators, I have trouble with that word, and executives are warning that the build out of artificial intelligence data centers has significantly increased the risk of electricity disruptions and blackouts. Panelists at a conference hosted by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, emphasize that the large-scale energy consumption from AI data centers presents challenges both to the supply and the demand side of the electrical grid. The expansion of AI has led to significant increases in the amount of electricity consumed by data centers. Analysts estimate that by 2035, data centers could account for up to 20% of global electrical use. Unlike residential and commercial electric use that fluctuates, large data centers draw massive, centralized, and constant power around the clock. This creates a significant and persistent strain on the grid, increasing the risk of blackouts during peak demand periods or extreme weather events. The Department of Energy issued a report in July that raised concerns about grid reliability, driven by increased risks from factors like the rising demand from AI centers, power plant retirements, and extreme weather. The DOE projects a 100-fold increase in the outage risk by 2030 without significant action taken by grid operators. If this is true, this will mean an average of 2.5 hours of power outages each day for the average US consumer connected to the grid, which to me is an amazing statistic. And while load demand is projected to explode over the next few years, the Trump administration continues its effort to scale back the development of renewable energy sources. Due to the elimination of incentives and uncertain funding future policies, companies are canceling or scaling back nearly $1.6 billion in clean energy projects last month alone, which brings the total of withdrawn investment to more than $24 billion so far this year, according to a recent report by the clean energy advocacy group E2. E2 reported that after the Inflation Reduction Act expanded federal clean energy incentives in 2022, companies committed or announced 415 major projects across 42 states and Puerto Rico, which represented $135 billion and 125,000 new jobs. But since the beginning of this year, 42 of these projects have been canceled, indicating that the overall trajectory of clean energy growth has sharply slowed. They put that in quotes in this report, according to that report. All right. Okay. The North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center released its third quarter 2025 edition of the 50 States of Solar. And this report identified three trends in state solar policies. The first trend is the continuing rollback or transition of net metering policies. And just spoiler alert, it's not great for consumers. State and utilities expanding into community solar, which is a positive, and the states are responding to the loss of federal incentives. States, primarily through their public utilities commissions, continue to chip away at net metering compensation, lowering the amount paid to those who own solar arrays who feed back to the grid. States also continued the expansion of community solar programs. If you're not familiar with what community solar is, it's basically where electric customers can buy into large solar projects and then allocate the portion of energy that's generated from those projects to their own electric bill at their home or their business, rather than putting the panels on their individual roofs. So that's one option that's expanding. And while these two trends have been highlighted in past reports, the new trend that emerged on this report was the expansion of financial incentives by the states to compensate for reduced incentives at the federal level. So, for example, Illinois regulators are moving fast to lock in federal clean energy dollars before they disappear. The Illinois Commerce Commission approved a major expansion of the state's long-term renewable resources procurement plan, doubling the capacity for small-scale community and commercial solar projects, and authorizing new competitive procurements for utility scale ahead of the phase-out of the investment tax credit. Illinois currently ranks in the top 5 states nationwide for community solar deployment, with more than 700 megawatts installed and hundreds more in development. And this sort of tips the hand to what we're going to talk to deeply here in a bit. And I put this in the I'll believe it when I see it department. Amazon announced a series of deals touting its plans to install small modular nuclear reactors near its data center in Washington state. This is dubbed the Cascade Advanced Energy Facility. The company announced it would deploy 12 small modular reactors capable of generating 960 megawatts on a footprint equivalent to a few city blocks. The data centers and nuclear advocates have been touting small modular reactors, or SMRs, as the answer to anticipated demand surges due to power-hungry AI applications. Others argue that the demand surge will take place within the next 5 to 10 years, and that SMR technologies is still in the early stages of development and hasn't yet been commercially deployed. Amazon announced targets for construction to begin in 5 to 7 years and will not be producing power until around 2039 from this facility. And that's the news from the solar industry. And I'm wondering, anybody else have anything they want to add to this? Anything that came across your desk? And I'll say for those people around video, we do have folks who join into the call, and I certainly want to invite conversation from those people as long as it's nice and you only agree with whatever I say. So that's see, I've already learned from our new administration.
Jay, I always agree with what you say.
Oh, you always do.
I would add that speaking from Hungary, from Budapest, the Hungarian government is in talks with the Trump administration to purchase nuclear fuel from manufactured by Westinghouse, and they are attempting to expand their use of nuclear. And Hungary is a landlocked country with a good deal of renewable energy strategies still underway. I would also add, though, that in the United States, as in the European countries, along with the stress and strain being put on the grid and on the production of electricity, these data centers are sucking up clean water like crazy. And that is also going to be a net loss for landowners, for consumers, and for the public, because that water is simply being taken usually from groundwater and turned into surface water. and it's not necessarily contaminated in the process of cooling these data centers, but it's not being used wisely. I'll put it that way.
Ah, okay. I also heard that Poland is a hotbed for nuclear activity at the moment as well in Europe, largely because they're transitioning from coal power plants. They're going to the next thing, and I guess they view nuclear as a viable option because then it can still be it follows the same infrastructure distribution kind of mechanism as opposed to having to reinvent everything with a distributed model. So, well, we'll touch on that a little bit, but yeah,
That
thanks for
that
that.
would be, that would be thermal pollution from those reactors. It's not, it's not pure water.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course, it raises, but when you're cooling, if you're using it for cooling, for sure. But I think the data centers generate quite a lot of heat, even if you're not talking about nuclear. Is that correct? From,
Yes. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yes.
So,
Hey,
okay.
hey, with all the cancellations of these large scale projects, could there be a an influx of panels?
Um, Possibly, although we're also seeing huge supply chain limitations on those panels at the moment, especially at the residential scale, because when they canceled off the incentives for residential installation as of December 31st of this year. Basically, everybody ran out, bought up as much supply as they could. Then at simultaneously, they kind of instituted another large tariff on imported panels. China is responsible for manufacturing directly or indirectly through Southeast Asian nations. 87% of all the world's solar panels. The U.S. manufacturing, a lot of those planned capacities were curtailed when they canceled the incentives for developing that domestically. So we're kind of in a short term restriction, supply chain restriction on all of that. So I think most of those large projects are going to be utility scale. So if they pretty much use different panels for the utility scale versus the residential scale. So, you can probably go out and still find 600-watt panels, but they're just too big for most homes with those, with the materials, with the inverters we use on residential. So, you raise a point, maybe, maybe not. I don't know. it's it's probably a longer lag on that. I don't think they had gone through the procurement process yet for those projects that have now been canceled. Any other comments from the group before we move on to webinars and the like? Give me just a second. All right, so let's go ahead and touch on the upcoming webinars, upcoming conferences, and as I'll usually try and give you a little mention here that the webinars I'm going to mention, I'm going to put the times in Eastern time for the U.S., and so you'll make that. And then I don't give you a link, but at least I try and give you who's putting it on. You can find them. We have those resources. So Maria is having October 28th today. They're gonna tonight have one on passive designs for green roofs, and then we've got one on ballasted ground mounting systems. These are kind of an interesting technology, and this is going to be tomorrow. It's basically where you can do a ballasted system like we usually see on flat roofs, but they just fill up these Tupperware bin, basically things with sand or gravel or something like that to hold them in place. It's a great option if you're a developer. Let's say you have a shopping mall that's been closed, it's sitting around, you're waiting for it to be redeveloped in some way, might take years. How about putting in a temporary solar array? There, you usually have infrastructure, enough transformers to handle it because it was a large load there. So something to consider for large temporary installations on a ground mounted system. Old, abandoned airports, abandoned parking lots. Solar United Neighbors going to have one on community solar in rural Ohio, 29th at 6 p.m. maximizing tax credits for carports. We were touching on that a little before we got started. And rooftop projects, November 4th, 2 p.m. through Solar Power World. There's one on the next generation inverter, November 11th at 2 p.m. CNI, or commercial and industrial storage design. That's going to be 2 p.m. on the 13th of November. There's a conference, Intersolar, and now, of course, they've added energy storage in North America. It's in Grapevine, Texas. Not really sure where Grapevine is. I assume around Dallas. That'd be my guess. But anyway, November 18th and 19th, it's an in-person conference. And then there's another in-person conference, Clean Fuels Conference in Orlando in January. That one just came across my desk. And of course, our shameless plug for our solar PV training. We have online courses, in-person courses. You can find that at solarpvtraining.com. And that's it for the webinars. I'll invite anybody else who might have something that they're going to or something they're aware of that they want to plug. Give you just a second. All right. So speaking of conferences, and this is kind of what got me thinking about this as a topic for Solar Noon Tuesday, about small modular nuclear reactors. And I just attended last week the Ohio Energy Conference. And it's a good conference. I enjoy that conference. And a little too much emphasis on natural gas to suit me, but I come in from a complete renewable energy perspective. And I would say that the group that was there maybe split 50-50 between natural gas folks and solar primarily. I didn't see any wind people. Okay, so I attended all of these sessions, have very distinguished panelists who analyze a lot of this. Of course, these data centers was the main topic of discussion. The perspective from the natural gas people was kind of interesting. I'll get to that in a second. But basically, the consensus of everybody is, I'll clean it up a little bit, but we're in trouble. The country is in trouble. We're facing an energy crisis. We're facing escalating costs of electricity. We're facing a grid that is not designed for this kind of load, and none of them had any solutions. That was the kind of thing that was striking to me. The solutions, to my way of thinking, would be a massive influx of federal incentives to build out the grid, but the Trump administration is canceling all of those. So they're reacting in exactly the wrong way to address a problem that's coming at us like it's like you're about to see. It's a slow moving car wreck. It's coming at us. We know it's going to come, and there's not a lot you can do about it when you're standing on the sidewalk. The response that they put forward was, if you've got the money, build your own power system. That's basically their response. And their response scales up all the way from residential. So those people who can afford it, go ahead and put solar on your home, to the company level, to the data center level, to the city level. Basically, it's like, okay, we're going to, the big buzzword at this conference was behind the meter. Everything that you're going to be putting in is going to be behind the meter, because the regulatory system is messed up. It takes 5 years to get an approval to connect to the grid. Well, don't connect to the grid. Build your whole system behind the meter. If you've got a huge demand from AI, well, build your own AI thing. Build your own energy source for the AI project. And it's got to be behind the meter. So that was kind of their solution. I could also, I guess, another takeaway. Oh, I mentioned about the natural gas people. They're feeling like, because the cost of energy is going up, that they're now a viable solution because they can charge more for natural gas, and now it makes it, economically feasible to drill for natural gas. That was kind of their whole perspective. That's no solution. It's basically saying, goody, the cost of everything is going up enough so that we can produce it at a profit. That's kind of the response. They had no response if you were to say, yeah, but I can produce it at half the cost that you're producing it for using solar. How are you going to compete against that? Not in their mindset. Their mindset is now I can sell natural gas at a profit. And that's kind of the legislators. We had a number of state senators, state representatives who were speaking. Two takeaways from them. One is I'm less impressed after seeing them than before I saw them. That's kind of sad. They didn't strike me as thoughtful, intelligent people. And as a group. And second one, their buzzword is I am technology agnostic. I heard every single one of them talking about being technology agnostic. What they basically mean is it's everybody, it's wind, it's solar, it's natural gas, it's coal, it's all of these things. I'm technology agnostic. But if you press it, it just reminded me a lot of that song from the Book of Mormon. If you've ever seen that play, it's like it's me and you, but mostly me. It's like I'm technology agnostic, but natural gas is really what we're talking about here. That was kind of their perspective. It's like if you push them, we shouldn't have subsidies for wind. We shouldn't have subsidies for solar. We shouldn't have subsidies for natural gas. I'm technology agnostic, except if there's a problem, and I'm happy to give subsidies to natural gas. So that was kind of my takeaway. So maybe my perspective there, but all right. So just as a reminder, these sessions do qualify for half an hour of continuing education for the solar certification through ETA. So go ahead and just put that in your mind if you're certified. So now let me jump forward. I sort of tipped my hand on all of that I'm renewable energy biased. I think that goes without saying. But let's put on the hand and just be technology agnostic and say, okay, why is nuclear suddenly something of interest to people again? And so let's look at it. Well, nuclear has very low emissions, right? It's a clean energy. When it's working properly, nuclear energy is green. It's as green as anything. Let's ignore the fuel source. Let's ignore the mining. Let's ignore the potentials for disaster. It is low emissions, low carbon emissions. It's reliable, consistent power. This is something that the data centers love, right? When we look at wind, if you look at a capacity factor, and capacity factor is basically saying, if this thing was operating at full capacity all the time, how does that compare to what it really produces? Like, what is it really producing divided by 24/7 full capacity? Wind is going to be around 34%. Solar, about 25%. This is what they always are referring to when they say the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine. Yeah, true. You don't have that power all the time. Nuclear, about 92%. Once that thing's up and running, it's up and running, and it's going to be generating at whatever load you wish it to produce at. It's energy dense. It produces a lot of power on a pretty small footprint. Once again, this is a factor that people love when you're talking about, I've got this huge sucking machine of energy called a data center. And if I just put a nuclear reactor right next to it, boy, I've got 24/7 clean energy right there. Doesn't take a lot of space. What's not to love? Energy security, they always tout this stuff. Of course, we're not reliant on foreign fossil fuels. We're not reliant on, Chinese solar panels, whatever. That to me is kind of nonsense. I don't feel more secure having a nuclear power plant that might be subject to sabotage or disasters or whatever. But yeah, that's what they say. And baseload power. Yeah, this is for sure. If you've got this strong, large capacity generating power, that can run the base loads, and then you can use wind and solar and batteries for that fluctuating variation in load demand. And that's kind of what they used to do with nuclear and with coal. coal power plants, very similar. Once these things are up and running, you just keep them running. And then fluctuation, you can use natural gas peaker plants. Now, more and more, you're using batteries to deal with this intermittent load demand because batteries are great. You can just turn them on and off. The problem with nuclear for turning it on and off, it might take you 3 or 4 days to power down that plant, start that plant back up. Coal, it might take, 6, 7, 8 hours. Natural gas, think of that like turning the burner on your stove. All of these plants are basically just tea kettles. They're just boiling water, making steam, running it through a turbine. So with natural gas, you can turn that thing on and in minutes, 40 minutes or whatever, it's generating. With batteries, flip a switch and you got power. So that's the ultimate for peak load. So we're moving in that direction. But this is a good base load. Okay, so those are some of the positives. Safe and clean, too cheap to meter. Okay, we'll see about that. All right, so those are the reasons why people like nuclear. And there are a lot of people out there who like nuclear. So what are the problems? Well, they're expensive. They cost a lot of money. So high capital costs. We'll delve a little bit into why some of that. And there are long construction delays, long time, even if everything goes right, and long delays typically. And many of these delays are caused through regulatory hurdles. And I was listening to a podcast in preparation of this where they were talking to a CEO of a small nuclear developer. And he was saying that the regulatory hurdles are huge for this industry. So coming from his perspective, he says it is a single mandate. The regulatory commission, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, has a single mandate, and that is public safety. Said they do not have a mandate to balance that with power generation. So it's all about public safety. So he said within that organization, any employee within the organization can put a halt on a project based on a safety concern. He was saying it could be an intern working at a desk or something like that with no technical background. And he said it would cascade and create basically a 2-year delay as that allegation was investigated. Now, whether that's true or not, whether he's exaggerating, it's clear that the regulation within this industry imposes certain delays. It may not be as extreme as what he was saying, maybe he's just living with frustrations, but there are hurdles there for sure. Public opposition. I mean, how many of us would like to have a nuclear power plant in our backyard? Small or not, it's still a bomb. I mean, you don't necessarily want that. Of course, I wouldn't want to have a gas power plant in my backyard either. It's just not something that's pleasant to have around. A lot of people would argue the same thing about wind turbines. They'd argue the same thing about solar panels. So when we have this kind of public infrastructure, these are large infrastructure projects, then there is going to be public opposition. Now with nuclear, if something goes wrong, I would say that is a bigger potential problem than perhaps a solar array or a wind turbine. I mean, the joke out there is, what do you call a renewable energy disaster or spill? It's a nice day, I mean, so the downside of something going wrong with a solar array is much more limited than the downside of a 3 Mile Island event or a Chernobyl event or a Fukushima event. All of these things are generational problems when they occur. So public opposition is certainly not going to go away. Then there's waste management. What do you do with the spent nuclear fuel when it's done? Some people will argue that, these little power plants, they use waste. They use nuclear waste. That's why they're going to be great. Well, they're not. They don't. Okay. Even the small modular reactors don't. There is a technology that does, theoretically, but the reading I saw is it's like 4 decades in the future. So 40 years from now, yeah, okay, maybe. But today, no, not at all. So they're using essentially the same fuel as a traditional nuclear reactor. And then decommissioning, big problem. It might cost you a certain amount to build it. It's going to cost you that much or more to decommission it, to take it apart. So what do you do at the end of life? And it's a big issue, especially now that most of the nuclear power plants that were built in the United States were built in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Well, they have a 30 or a 40, 50-year life expectancy. Well, that's come and due right now. They're at or beyond their sell-by date. So if you wanted to decommission them, I always think of this as like riding on the back of a tiger. You can't get off. And how are you going to deal with that? So decommissioning is a big issue. So when we talk about what are we talking about when we're talking about how expensive these things are, or the delays or things like that? Our only experience in the last 40 years is the Vogtle plants in Georgia. There have only been 2 nuclear reactors constructed and commissioned in the United States since the late 1970s. And those are the 2 plants down there in Georgia. And track record's not great. It took twice as much time as was originally projected, and it cost twice as much money as was originally projected. Double, it was nearly $30 billion to build these power plants. And it's estimated that the cost overruns have tacked on an additional 10% to every Georgia electric bill, because you have this super, super expensive nuclear power. So at this point, let me just open it up for comment. I see a few things flipping through the chat there, but does anybody have any comment so far on some of the things I've discussed, or something you want to add to the discussion? Because I would really love to have a little bit of a back and forth. Yeah, Pete, you've got a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the whole point of baseload plants was supposed to be that they were cheap. And we're not seeing that with coal and nuclear generation. It's not cheap. So we may as well run combined cycle and other dispatchable power 100% of the time, because they're the cheapest.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the commentators, when I was listening to these podcasts, said there were, in the early days, inexpensive nuclear power plants, comparatively inexpensive. His argument was that the safety concerns, of course, have added a layer of bureaucracy to this. Yep. But to me, the largest thing was, the most convincing argument is, through regulation, the people who develop these power plants are paid on a cost plus basis. So the more expensive the plant, the more profit they make. So there is zero incentive to bring down the costs and zero incentive to bring it in on time. So if you're in the business of developing a nuclear power plant, then the more it costs, the more money you make. And that's not a model for inexpensive electricity. So that's a huge issue as far as I can see. And the same kind of thing happens with infrastructure within our regular national grid, and the same thing with other power plants. So I would say that's a competitive advantage for distributed energy, because these distributed energy projects are owned by the user. So there's a great incentive for them to bring the cost down as much as possible, because they're paying for it out of pocket. They're not going to some regulatory agency and saying, okay, how much can I charge for this? And, so that's an issue. Another issue that was raised, and I'll touch on it a little bit more, but this is a good place for it, I think, is if you're building 1 nuclear power plant or 2 nuclear power plants every 40 years, guess what? You don't have a workforce. You don't have trained engineers who know how to do this thing. Yep. So you're basically learning on the job, So that's, again, these are some of the arguments in favor of small modular nuclear reactors. They're trying to combat some of these issues, but there's just no workforce. Everyone is individually built. So these are some of the issues. Anybody else have a comment? Yeah.
Just briefly, I would add that part of the operational costs include very intense security, and that's only going to get worse because of the the world as it is, whether it's a cyber attack or whether it's a physical attack. These things are targets.
Yeah. Yeah. And I keep thinking, boy, we're one badly programmed drone away from a nuclear disaster in the Ukraine. I mean, all it takes is a little drone bomb to land there, and that's problematic. So yeah, they could take out a solar array, and nobody would really care. But yeah, you're right. These are targets not only militarily, but cyber attack targets and other type situations. Anytime you have a centralized location, and this is one of the arguments in favor of distributed energy, is the more centralized it is, the less secure it is from attacks, whether they're cyber or whether they're physical. So. All right, I'll jump forward and say, okay, so why is it so expensive? We've touched on a little bit of this. The regulatory requirements are huge here in the United States. Now, in some countries, nuclear is progressing along, but in the United States, basically, we are in a non-position. There, as I said, there are only two plants, two power structures. They're not even plants; they're just turbines that were built at a facility in the last 40 years. So in order to get a license for this technology, so we're talking about a new technology here with small nuclear reactors. They estimate it'll cost $1 billion and take 10 years to get that license to build one. So that's a big issue, even before you get started. As I mentioned, the cost plus profit motive, the more expensive you make it, the more money you're going to make. So again, who's going to make sure that it comes in on time? The workforce, well, I just mentioned there are no engineers, there are no construction people in this industry. They have to either train them up or learn on the job as they go, and they're very expensive to operate. Once you're there, they talk about how the fuel is not super expensive. Well, I would question that. I think they externalize a lot of the costs of that. But there's a lot of people who work at these nuclear power plants, safety, security, oversight. So I know one of the power plants they were talking about, they said there were 1,000 people working at that nuclear facility. I mean, that's a lot of folks. We see this in a solar array, there's some maintenance guys, but just not that many people. You would counter that by saying, okay, but look at the huge footprint that's required to generate a comparative or similar amount of energy. Yeah, fair enough. Good point. So when we look at the actual levelized cost of electricity, we're looking at nuclear is always at the top. Nuclear is huge. And just to give you a little bit of perspective, now this includes operating currently existing power plants. So my assumption is you build something new, it's going to be even more expensive, but that may not be a valid assumption. But anyway, so we're saying it's going to be up there around $200 per megawatt of generating capacity for nuclear versus a little over $50 for wind and solar. So essentially 4 times the price of its cheapest competitor. And the question I always have in my mind is, why would I pay that premium? I mean, my goal is to have electricity. And if I'm a business person, I want the least cost electricity that I can have. Historically, nuclear has been 4 times the cost, or historically, the last few years, it's 4 times the cost of the alternative. So am I so married to this nuclear vision that I'm going to prefer that? Okay, so they're coming back now. The advocates for nuclear is coming back and saying, okay, all these problems that you raised are true. They're expensive. There's this potential cost overruns, all of that stuff. So our solution is going to be small. Well, let's make them small, right? Let's just make them small and let's make them modular. Because then what we can do is we can take advantage of Wright's law. Essentially, we can make them in factories and we can haul them out to these sites on the back of tractor trailers. I mean, this is what I've heard. I'm assuming you've heard the advocates of this. They're like, yeah, okay. Nuclear was expensive, but we can just make these things like mobile homes and factories, and we can drive them out there to the site. We'll park them in the parking lot. They'll generate a lot of power, and the costs will come down. Wright's law of the learning curve. And if you're not familiar, I mean, this is kind of what one of them looks like, or at least a prototype. You can see just size-wise people standing around there. But what is Wright's law? And this is a term I wasn't that familiar with. I think I vaguely heard it. But it basically says that as production doubles, you're going to save about 20% in cost, that you have this learning curve that goes forward. It's a little comparative to like Moore's law. And so, okay, we've built 2 of these things in the last 40 years. Now, if we're starting to look at building hundreds, then realistically, that cost is going to come down substantially. And that's probably as far as the economic analysis goes. There's this assumption, yes, as you scale these things up, if you build them in factories, you're going to bring down the cost. Great. So what are we talking about when we talk about small nuclear or small modular reactors? Well, this is kind of an interesting thing because a lot of the discussion at the moment is as this industry is developing, the argument was, okay, let's make them small. Let's make them modular, just like I just said. But once they get into it, it doesn't pencil out. So these things keep getting bigger. So the small nuclear reactors that are being designed today are actually 300 megawatts compared to the early large nuclear reactors that were like 500 megawatts. So these are not something that you build on the back and put on the back of a trailer. These are constructed very similarly to regular nuclear power plants. And they're, okay, half the size. Well, all of the advantages that they're touting go away because they're not small. They're not modular. They're basically a reduced size of the same thing that didn't work before. So that's kind of an issue there. So now they're bringing up the term micro nuclear reactors. And they're saying, okay, well, micro, that's going to be 1 to 20 megawatts. These are the guys that are on the back of the trailer. I guess my question was, if it didn't work for small, why is it going to work for micro? You change the name, great. I mean, that's good. So my guess is it's still a pipe dream. I was talking to somebody at the conference and he was saying, well, small nuclear reactors, yeah, that's the thing. I said, yeah, but the problem is they don't exist. And it's like, yeah, but they will. And I said, but I think we should power it with magic because, yeah, okay, it doesn't exist, but maybe it will. I mean, it's just hope. I mean, it's like, I want there to be an industry, so I'm just going to hope there's an industry. Well, yeah, good luck with that. So what is the current state of the industry? So, like I said, they don't really exist. There are only 2 currently in operation. There's one in Russia, a 70 megawatt thing that started up in 2020, supposedly. And I question that these are our 2 sources of information, Russia and China. They're even less reliable than the United States. How's that? So China has, that's not a big one. Or that's not small, I should say. That's 210 megawatts, right? So these are the 2 that they point to as currently generating power. Okay, there's a big difference between I'm fixing to generate power versus I am generating power. So That's our state. Now, in the United States, we see a lot of reports that there is a small nuclear reactor that has been licensed by the American regulatory process called from NuScale. NuScale, and this if you ask ChatGPT, if you look up headlines, it will say that NuScale received their license from the what is it, the Atomic Regulatory or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Yeah, except they didn't. They got a certificate. And the way it was described was they submitted their designs and the commission said, good job. I like that. Let's go forward. Okay. The analogy was like getting a star on your 8th grade spelling paper. It means as much as that. They just said, design looks good. All right. Keep up the good work. Now, if you want to, apply for a license. Okay. Except the license is going to take 10 years and costs $1 billion. So nobody in the United States has yet begun the formal process of applying for a license for a small modular nuclear reactor. Okay, I think that's important to note, that if this is the thing that's going to save our bacon from this AI demand, we're 10 years away from having a prototype ready and licensed to go. Okay, so that's a detail. All right, so if these small modular nuclear reactors are going to be a thing, well, okay, they address some of the issues. I would say they address the high initial capital costs. They address the long construction delays. And if they work the way they're touted, they may even address the decommissioning. They're smaller, just dump them in a lake somewhere. I don't know. Do whatever they do. They just drive through southeastern Ohio, push them off the back of the trailer down a holler. That's how they deal with stuff. So what are the other options? Well, what are the other hurdles? Do they get past the regulatory hurdle? I don't see anywhere that they're addressing that. It's just a smaller version, but it's still nuclear. Do they get past public opposition? If anything, I think you'll start to see larger opposition because now there are more of them in more places. So that would increase opposition, I would imagine. They use the same fuel. They have the same disposal issues. So again, you're increasing your waste management issues. There's no Yucca Mountain to dump these things in. At the moment, most of the wasted nuclear fuel, to my understanding, is sitting in the parking lot of these power plants because they cannot transport them and there's nowhere to put them. So they're building up in the parking lots. Well, that's highly secure. And it's an unproven technology. So at best, if you had a design that was going to work, then, maybe not. In fact, that new, what was it? NuScale. I've got to see, what was that thing? Yeah, NuScale. The certification they got in 2020, they got that one for a 50 megawatt design. And then they decided, no, that's not going to work. So they started over with a 77 megawatt design. Okay, so even they got an A on their spelling test, but they had to go and retake a different spelling test, So 5 years later, so they lost 5 years just on that. So this is new technology. Maybe it works great, maybe it doesn't. Are you willing to bet billions and billions of dollars on something that's unproven? I wouldn't. So what we're really dealing with is a lot of PR, just a lot of public announcements. Ontario Power up there, our Canadian friends have decided to sort of go all in on a project with GE Hitachi. My guess, if I had to project out, it probably is going to get built and it will be hugely expensive and it'll be one of those boondoggles that everybody will say, whoa, but how come that doubled our electric bill? Because you got this power behind it, but it's going to be 15 years in the future. It's going to be 20 years in the future. So there are some other ones that are announced, just like this announcement that we had in the news this week from Amazon. all of this stuff is PR, you know. There's nothing really concrete happening there. And so let's look at the optimistic timeline. If we decide we want small modular reactors to be a thing, well, it's going to be 10 years for a design to be licensed if it started today. Then to get permission to construct is going to be another 5 to 10 years. And then to construct it is going to be 3 to 5 years. And then once it's done, it's going to be a year to get the thing commissioned. So optimistically, 19 years to have the first one operational here in the United States. So now we're talking about 2044 for this. So I would say maybe we won't have the demand need in 19 years. You know, that's something I don't hear people discussing. We see this kind of thing. I asked ChatGPT, all right, how long would it take us to build out the infrastructure for a 30% increase in demand growth? And the response basically came in somewhere between 5 and 15 years. All right, using various technologies, if we're serious about it. And when we look at some of these demand charts like this load demand chart here, these are projections. But I think the thing I want you to draw your attention to is from the World War II up until about 1999, 2000, we had pretty steady load demand growth. And if you think about that historically, it's essentially the United States, and this is US consumption. We were industrializing. We were growing. Population was growing pretty dramatically. So we saw the build out of our industrial and suburban lifestyle. But when we hit around the year 2000, load demand essentially stagnated for 25 years. We had very little increase in load demand. There was a move towards technology that uses less energy. There was a move towards energy efficient appliances, things of that nature that offset what we might otherwise see as load demand. And now we're getting into this sudden mode of explosive load demand. And we've highlighted a lot of this before, reasons like EVs, AI, data centers, electrification of heat, electrification of industry. So these load demand charts are just shooting up through the roof. And this is what's generating a lot of the buzz at the moment. And we're going to see that for a period of time, for sure. But wouldn't it make more sense, or as likely, the scenario be that at some point AI is going to figure out that the cost benefit for the amount of energy is not worth it. So they're going to have to come up with less power hungry solutions, just like we come up with energy efficient appliances. If we come up with less power hungry data centers, well, that's going to have an impact. If, you know, or we build out the infrastructure, if we don't see population growth at some point, you've met your demand. You've met the increased demand, and now we plateau again. So I would say in 10 years, we're probably going to be at a place where it's going to plateau again for a while. And the only reason I bring that up is just to say, maybe this load growth is not infinite, you know, and if we haven't responded to it in 10 or 15 years, we're probably going to have an economic recession that's going to reduce load demand. So those are sort of a self-correcting mechanism. And then if you forget all about the fact that everybody's shifting over to their own distributed infrastructure, so if half of the buildings in the country installed solar, that would meet the projected load demand in and of itself without any additions to the grid. And I'm of the mindset that the grid as we know it is an antiquated and disappearing institution, and we're going to have to completely revitalize it. So distributed energy is really where we're going. So the combination of distributed and grid supplements is going to be really our solution. So that's my way of saying that. So small nuclear reactors, yeah, not a thing. They're chasing grant money. That's kind of it. They're chasing corporate investment money. There's always going to be some guy who couldn't afford to buy his own penis rocket who's thinking, I can build a small nuclear reactor. It's only going to cost me $500 million. That's pocket change. So, there's the AI tech bros. There's going to be some money. It's going to keep, but 5 years from now, my guess is we'll all talk about this like, yeah, that was dumb. So, all right, I'll give you 2 minutes here to respond. And anybody have any comments before we knock it out? Ralph, are you saying goodbye or are you just responding?
Just responding. One area of the globe that the small nuclear modular reactors would be handy in is, for example, for Americans in Alaska and in Canada above north of 60, the latitude.
Yeah.
Where you have long winters, no sun whatsoever, and the wind is erratic and sometimes severe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but they'd have to be super small because there just is not the load demand of the prototypes that are currently out here.
But our new defense spending requires that we have installations up there.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, I did ask because I've heard this too. Well, we've been building small nuclear reactors on submarines forever. Why don't we just take that technology? And I looked into that, and basically it does not have the safety protocols. It does not have all the oversight that would be required for a consumer thing. So by the time you institute all of those the costs just escalate. Plus, the government really doesn't care about costs when you're talking about a nuclear sub. So it doesn't have to be competitive with solar, for example.
Well, with the nuclear submarine, you're in a heat sink. You're swimming around in a heat sink. So
that's true. So you don't have to worry about heat dissipation. All right. Well, I see that we're at the end of our time. I appreciate your attention, and I guess I will see you all again next week. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.